The sleek, modern store was buzzing with the kind of quiet energy that only comes from mid-morning rushes. Customers browsed shelves filled with the latest gadgets, and employees moved briskly, expertly balancing restocking duties with customer inquiries. It was the kind of scene that could have come from any upscale electronics retailer, a place where appearances and professionalism mattered as much as the products they sold. Among the shoppers was Marcus Carter, a tall, well-dressed black man in his mid-30s who carried himself with an air of quiet confidence. He moved through the store with purpose, occasionally stopping to inspect a product or glance at a display. To any casual observer, he looked like a typical customer, calm, composed, and well within his element. But to the employees watching him from a distance, Marcus wasn't just another customer. Whispers began circulating among the staff, growing louder with each exchanged glance. A young employee near the register leaned over to his colleague, his voice low but his tone suspicious. "That guy's been walking around for a while now," he said, nodding discreetly in Marcus's direction. "Doesn't look like he's buying anything." His coworker, a slightly older woman with a sharp bob haircut, glanced over her shoulder, her eyes narrowing. "Yeah, and did you see the way he keeps checking out the high-end stuff? Bet you he's casing the place." The assumptions, though baseless, spread quickly. Soon, nearly every employee was on edge, their eyes darting toward Marcus whenever he approached a display. They watched as he examined a sleek laptop, his fingers lightly brushing the edges of the screen before he moved on. The tension in the air thickened when Marcus reached into his pocket, pulling out his phone to check a message. "Did he just pocket something?" one of the employees whispered nervously. Before anyone could answer, the store manager, a man in his late 40s with a no-nonsense demeanor, strode onto the floor. His name tag read Rick, and his expression carried the weight of someone who had dealt with more than his fair share of headaches. "What's going on?" Rick asked, his voice cutting through the murmurs. The younger employee wasted no time, pointing toward Marcus. "That guy over there, he's acting suspicious. I think he might be stealing." Rick's brow furrowed as he followed the employee's gaze. He observed Marcus for a moment, noting his composed demeanor and expensive-looking attire. But the seed of doubt had already been planted, and Rick's expression hardened. "I'll handle it," he said, adjusting his tie and walking toward Marcus with deliberate strides. Marcus, oblivious to the growing storm around him, was now inspecting a pair of noise-canceling headphones. He barely noticed Rick's approach until the manager's shadow loomed over him. "Excuse me, sir," Rick began, his tone firm but measured. "Can I help you with something?" Marcus turned to face him, his expression calm but slightly puzzled. "No, thank you. I'm just browsing." Rick's eyes scanned Marcus's hands, then his pockets. "Browsing, huh? You've been in the store for quite some time now." Marcus raised an eyebrow, catching the subtle accusation in Rick's tone. "Is that a problem?" "Well," Rick said, crossing his arms, "we've had issues with theft recently. I hope you understand why I need to be cautious." The implication hung heavily in the air, and for a moment, Marcus said nothing. Around them, other employees pretended to busy themselves while discreetly watching the interaction. Customers began to notice, their curious glances adding to the growing tension. "I see," Marcus finally said, his voice steady but tinged with disappointment. "And do you approach every customer like this, or just the ones who look like me?" Rick bristled at the comment, his professionalism faltering. "Look, sir, I'm just doing my job. If you've got nothing to hide, you shouldn't have a problem with me asking a few questions." Marcus stared at him for a long moment, then let out a quiet sigh. "You're right," he said, slipping his phone back into his pocket. "Let's make this easy." Before Rick could respond, Marcus turned and began walking toward the front of the store. Rick followed closely, his suspicion unwavering. By now, the situation had drawn enough attention that a few customers whispered among themselves, their curiosity piqued by the unfolding drama. When Marcus reached the customer service counter near the entrance, he stopped and turned to face Rick. The manager stood a few feet away, his arms still crossed, his expression still tense. "Do you have any idea who I am?" Marcus asked, his voice calm, but with an edge that hinted at something more. Rick smirked, his confidence growing as he felt the weight of authority on his side. No, but I'm sure you're about to tell me. Marcus smiled faintly, though there was no humor in it. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a sleek black wallet. Flipping it open, he produced a card and held it out for Rick to see. The manager's smirk faded instantly. His eyes widened as he read the words printed on the card, his face draining of color. Behind him, the employees who had been watching closely leaned in, trying to catch a glimpse of what had left their boss so shaken. Marcus's voice broke the stunned silence. "Now, I suggest you call a meeting with your staff," he said, his tone commanding but devoid of anger, "because we need to have a very serious conversation about professionalism and respect in this establishment." Rick swallowed hard, his arrogance replaced by a palpable sense of dread. As Marcus stood there, composed and unyielding, it was clear that the narrative had shifted entirely. The man they had accused of theft wasn't just a customer, he was their boss. And for Rick and his team, the real reckoning was only just beginning. The air in the store grew heavy with an uncomfortable silence. Employees exchanged uneasy glances, trying to piece together what had just happened. Rick, the usually confident manager, now looked like a deer caught in headlights, his composure completely shattered. Marcus's calm, authoritative demeanor stood in stark contrast to the tension crackling around him. Rick stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't realize." Marcus didn't let him finish. "You didn't realize what? That someone who looks like me could own this place, or that your assumptions could get you into a lot of trouble." Rick's mouth opened, but no words came out. The weight of Marcus's gaze seemed to pin him in place. Behind him, the younger employee who had first raised the alarm shifted uncomfortably, his face pale. The rest of the staff avoided eye contact altogether, suddenly finding the floor or their clipboards fascinating. Marcus sighed and slid his wallet back into his pocket. "Let's not do this here," he said, his voice quieter now but no less firm. "Gather your team in the break room. We're going to talk." Rick nodded quickly, almost too eagerly, and began motioning for his staff to follow him. The employees moved reluctantly, their steps slow and hesitant, like schoolchildren being called to the principal's office. Marcus didn't follow immediately. Instead, he took a moment to glance around the store, his eyes scanning the faces of the remaining customers. Some looked curious, others shocked, but all of them seemed to be silently rooting for him. Once the floor was clear of employees, Marcus finally walked toward the back of the store, his footsteps measured and deliberate. As he passed by a young woman holding a shopping basket, she gave him a small, encouraging nod. Marcus returned it with a faint smile, though the weight of the situation pressed heavily on him. In the break room, the atmosphere was thick with tension. The employees stood in awkward clusters, avoiding the lone chair in the center of the room, which Rick had claimed. He sat with his elbows on his knees, his hands clasped tightly, as if trying to anchor himself. The younger employee, whose name tag read Even, fidgeted with his phone, his nervous energy palpable. The woman with the sharp bob, identified as Karen on her tag, stood near the coffee machine, her arms crossed defensively. When Marcus entered, the quiet chatter ceased instantly. All eyes turned to him, and for a moment, no one moved. He closed the door behind him and leaned against it, his arms crossed over his chest. His calm expression didn't betray the storm of emotions swirling within him. "First," Marcus began, his voice steady, "I want to make one thing very clear. I didn't come here today to catch anyone off guard or to throw my weight around. I came here because I believe in knowing my business from the ground up. I wanted to see how this store operates when no one's watching." He let the words hang for a moment, watching the employees' reactions. Rick's face turned an even deeper shade of red, and Karen's defensive posture softened slightly. Even, still fidgeting, avoided looking directly at Marcus. But instead, Marcus continued, his tone sharpening. "I walked into an environment where I was immediately judged, not for my actions, but for who I am and how I look. Let's not pretend that's not what happened here." Karen opened her mouth as if to protest, but Marcus raised a hand, silencing her before she could speak. "I don't want excuses or justifications. What I want is accountability. So let's start with you." He pointed at Rick, whose eyes widened in surprise. Tell me, Rick, Marcus said, his voice calm but piercing. When Evan came to you with his concerns, what made you decide to approach me the way you did? Did you stop to think about whether his assumptions were valid, or did you just go along with it? Rick hesitated, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. Finally, he managed to stammer, I thought I was doing my job. We've had thefts before, and I didn't want to take any chances. Marcus nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. I see. And in those previous thefts, did you approach every suspect the same way? Or was there something about me that made you think I was more likely to be a thief? Rick looked down at his hands, his silence answering the question more clearly than words ever could. Marcus turned his attention to Evan. And you, he said, his tone softening slightly but still firm. Why did you think I was suspicious? Was it something I did, or was it just a feeling? Evan's face turned beet red. He swallowed hard, his voice shaky as he replied, I don't know. I guess I just thought you were acting different. Like you were looking for something to steal. Marcus raised an eyebrow. And what does a thief look like, Evan? Is it someone who walks confidently? Someone who's dressed well? Or was there something else you were looking at? Evan's gaze dropped to the floor, and his shoulders slumped. I'm sorry, he mumbled. I didn't mean to. Marcus held up a hand, stopping him mid-sentence. It's not just about what you meant, Evan. It's about what you did. Your assumptions didn't just affect me. They exposed a problem in this workplace culture, and that's something we need to address. The room fell silent again, the weight of Marcus's words settling over everyone like a heavy blanket. Marcus looked around, taking in the uncomfortable expressions of the staff. He wanted them to understand, not just the gravity of their actions, but the importance of doing better moving forward. I'm not here to punish anyone, he said finally, his tone softer now. But I am here to make it clear that this kind of behavior, this kind of mindset, has no place in my company. If we're going to be successful, we need to treat every customer, every employee, and every person who walks through those doors with respect and dignity. No exceptions. He paused, letting his words sink in. I'm going to give you all a chance to reflect on this and do better. But make no mistake, if I ever see this kind of behavior again, there will be consequences. With that, Marcus pushed off the door and straightened his jacket. Rick, I expect a full report on how you're going to address this issue by the end of the day. And I suggest you start by apologizing, not just to me, but to your team and your customers. Rick nodded mutely, his face still pale. Marcus glanced at the rest of the employees, his expression softening slightly. Thank you for your time, he said before turning and walking out of the room. As the door closed behind him, the employees let out a collective breath they hadn't realized they were holding. The silence in the break room was deafening, but the lesson was undeniable. Marcus Carter wasn't just their boss. He was a man who expected better. And now, it was up to them to rise to the challenge. As Marcus left the break room, the weight of the confrontation still clinging to him, he took a moment to compose himself. He wasn't angry, not anymore, but the disappointment lingered. This wasn't the first time he'd experienced something like this, but it never got easier. Walking through the store, he noticed how the atmosphere had shifted. Customers who had witnessed the earlier interaction gave him discreet nods or smiles of quiet encouragement, while others pretended not to notice. He stopped by a display of tablets, his fingers brushing lightly over the sleek surface of one. He wasn't really interested in the device. His mind was elsewhere, replaying the events of the last hour. The assumptions, the whispers, the stares. It all felt so familiar. Too familiar. Marcus's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of someone clearing their throat. He turned to see an older customer, a woman with silver hair and kind eyes, standing a few feet away. She hesitated, clutching a box containing a pair of wireless earbuds. "Excuse me," she began, her voice soft. "I just wanted to say, well, I saw what happened earlier, and I'm sorry. You handled it with so much grace. I don't think I could have done the same." Marcus offered her a small, genuine smile. "Thank you," he said. "It's not always easy, but sometimes that's the only way forward." She nodded, her expression thoughtful. "I hope they learned something from this," she added before walking away, leaving Marcus alone once again. As he watched her go, Marcus couldn't help but think about the employees in the break room. Would they truly learn from this experience? Or would they see it as just another uncomfortable moment to brush under the rug? The thought nagged at him as he made his way toward the store's exit. He wasn't leaving. He had no intention of letting this go unresolved, but he needed a moment to breathe, to step away from the tension that had built up inside. Outside, the crisp air helped clear his mind. Marcus leaned against the side of his car, his eyes scanning the busy parking lot. He thought about his journey, how he built his company from the ground up, overcoming countless obstacles along the way. He'd worked too hard and come too far to let moments like this define him, yet they still weighed heavily. Back inside, the break room was a study in discomfort. Rick sat at the table, staring blankly at the untouched cup of coffee in front of him. Karen leaned against the wall, her arms crossed, while Evan paced nervously. The rest of the employees were scattered around the room, their expressions ranging from guilt to confusion. Evan finally broke the silence. "I didn't mean for it to get this out of hand," he said, his voice shaky. I didn't know he was our boss." Karen gave him a sharp look. "Does it matter if he was the boss or not? What you did was wrong either way." Evan's face flushed, and he stopped pacing, his gaze dropping to the floor. "I know," he mumbled. I don't know what I was thinking." Rick sighed heavily, running a hand through his thinning hair. "We all screwed up," he admitted. "But now we have to figure out how to fix this. The last thing we need is for this to get out. Can you imagine the backlash?" Karen raised an eyebrow. "You're worried about backlash. Maybe you should be worried about doing the right thing for once." Rick glared at her, but before he could respond, the door opened, and Marcus stepped inside. The room fell silent as all eyes turned to him. He stood in the doorway for a moment, his gaze sweeping over the group. "Am I interrupting?" Marcus asked, his tone neutral but pointed. Rick quickly shook his head. "No, of course not. We were just talking about how to move forward." Marcus nodded, stepping further into the room. "Good, because moving forward is exactly what we need to do. But let me make one thing clear. This isn't about damage control. This is about accountability, and accountability starts with understanding where we went wrong." He turned his attention to Evan, who looked like he wanted to disappear into the floor. "Evan, I appreciate that you've admitted your mistake. That's the first step. But now I need you to think about why you made that assumption in the first place. What biases or fears were influencing your judgment?" Evan hesitated, his eyes darting around the room as if searching for an escape. Finally, he took a deep breath and said, "I don't know. I guess I've seen stuff like this happen before, and I didn't want to be the guy who ignored it if something was actually going on." Marcus's expression softened slightly, though his gaze remained steady. "I get it. You thought you were doing the right thing. But good intentions don't excuse bad actions. If you want to grow from this, you have to confront the biases that led you here." Evan nodded, his shoulders slumping. "I will," he said quietly. Marcus shifted his focus to Rick. "And you, Rick. As the manager, you set the tone for this store. Your team looks to you for guidance, and today you failed them. Instead of leading with fairness and professionalism, you let assumptions dictate your actions." Rick opened his mouth to respond, but Marcus held up a hand. "I don't want excuses. What I want is for you to take responsibility and ensure this doesn't happen again. That means training, open discussions, and a commitment to creating a culture of respect. Can you do that?" Rick nodded slowly, his face solemn. "Yes, I can." "Good," Marcus said, his tone firm. "Because if I don't see real progress, I'll find someone else who can." The room was silent as Marcus's words hung in the air. The employees exchanged uneasy glances, each of them grappling with their own role in what had unfolded. For Marcus, the path forward was clear. This wasn't just about addressing a single incident. It was about creating lasting change, and he wouldn't stop until he saw it happen. As he left the break room once again, Marcus felt a renewed sense of purpose. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but he was ready to face it head on. And this time, he wouldn't be walking it alone.